Afternoon, everyone. As you can hear straight up, I'm struggling with my voice a little bit today. So if at any point I do fade out completely and I lose my voice, the wonderful tones of Jeff McMullen will join you and he will actually finish my speech for you. Then I'll probably go over for some clinical care from our ENT who's here. All arranged for me by New South Wales Health. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation to join you today to participate in these important discussions. I'd like to begin by paying my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and, of course, pay my respects to Elders past, present and our future emerging generations from whom this work is so important. Thank you, Uncle Ray, for your warm welcome to country. And thank you to the previous panel for sharing your deep experience, expertise and wisdom, guided by the expert facilitation of Kerry Arabina. You spoke of the many reasons why we need to reset what we are doing in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health. And when I say we, I mean this very broadly. This is a responsibility that extends far beyond this room and the organisations and communities that we serve, to include the wider Australian society. Often at Katzenham, and I'm sure you've seen this as well, we see an assumption amongst wider society that Indigenous peoples alone are responsible for improving Indigenous health outcomes. This is a wrongful assumption for so many reasons, not least that we are 3% of the population and it's 97% who are the holders of power, as this slide demonstrates. We cannot do this work as an us and them. But of course, our people must be the leaders in this work. In my time with you today, it's my honour to consider how we might reset and what this might look like, particularly when informed by Indigenous community-led ways to wellness and health. For those of you who know me, know that I'm a proud Narungagana woman, mother of 5. I grew up on the Yorke Peninsula in South Australia, and it won't surprise you, if you know me, that I took the question of resetting quite literally. It prompted me to spend some time contemplating various pieces of technology from my Nintendo, yes, I still have a Nintendo, to my laptop and their reset buttons. I've thought about the concept of a reset button and how scary it is to press for fear of losing valuable data. So it takes some courage and trust to touch that reset button. I also thought about how seductive the concept of a reset button is. It sounds so easy, but as we all know, achieving transformational change is almost never as simple as pressing a reset button. It can be disruptive and unsettling. If you press the reset button on your computer, but the underlying operating system is outdated, overloaded, corrupted, or unsafe, then you won't actually be making things any better. And I think this is a good analogy for where we find ourselves in Indigenous affairs, especially in the health sector. Over the years, we've had many endless series of governments and ministers and policymakers pressing the equivalent to the reset button, announcing a groundbreaking or perhaps game-changing new policy or program. I'm sure many of us have lost count of the amount of times we've heard the very fine words in new policy statements promising self-determination, respectful working relationships and better health for our people, only to find the same old incompetent operating system that is based upon, and we heard it earlier, controlling us rather than enabling us to determine our own futures. It reminds me of this skit from a popular TV series. Now, if you don't know this TV series, it's going to fall flat for you, but you can YouTube it later. It's Little Britain. We're asked what we want, we pop it, we tell them, they put it into the computer, and the computer says no. That was my best effort at an English accent with laryngitis. So it's no wonder that most of us have lost trust in the magic reset due to the underlying flaws in the operating system. And it's not just resetting the system, it's also our behaviours that need to change. If my children are stuck on a level in one of their computer games, they can reset the level and they can try again. But if they do the same things, they will soon get stuck in the same position until they discover new ways of doing things. Let me focus on the issue of trust for a second. If we were to treat mistrust like an illness, We have to look at the root cause of why trust and power sharing doesn't already occur in this society. When you are a member of dominant culture, your identity is constantly affirmed and reinforced in ways that you probably don't even realise. As this slide shows, for dominant culture, life is normal. But for those of us living outside of this dominant culture, it can be challenging, especially because those of us who do not belong in dominant culture and have a long history of being viewed as less than and not being trusted. It is this institutional and scientific racism that Charles Darwin and beyond that sought to put us at the bottom of the evolutionary ladder, enabling endless atrocities to be perpetuated against us and our families, including by scientists, health services, and health protection and child protection agencies. In fact, we have learnt that whenever governments announce that they are protecting us, we immediately need to be cautious. This ongoing history of control, exclusion, and disrespect doesn't build for a good or healthy, trusting relationship in our foundation. This goes to the heart of cultural racism and institutional racism, which we heard again about earlier. In straightforward terms, cultural racism positions Indigenous peoples as the problem. Institutional racism occurs when non-Aboriginal people believe they have the answers to address the problem, and we've seen this in history, right? Reconciliation Australia has gathered some data on the trust gap in its State of Reconciliation report, which is a race relations barometer, showing in 2016 just 24% of the general community felt that they trusted Indigenous Australians, while 46% of us, Indigenous Australians, trusted other Australians. This is something that Katsanam has been advocating for, is a barometer in health to measure our race relations, our trust within the system. These figures on the slide remind us of how horribly the operating system has been corrupted by the virus of racism and its pervasiveness across all systems, from institutions to interpersonal interactions. This epidemic virus is extremely debilitating for those directly affected. For dominant society, this sick system is just normal, and members of dominant society so often fail to even recognise it. Many Australians, including our own politicians, find it difficult to accept that racism even exists in this country. I invite them to watch social media on Australia Day, perhaps. Indigenous peoples do not have the privilege of holding this false belief, for we see it, we feel it, and we hear it every day. This slide represents some of my favourite insults. And people, when they're often saying these things to me, actually think that they're offering me a compliment. Racism is a common experience for us. We talk about it in our families. And there are many studies that provide evidence to support this statement. These experiences of racism have serious impacts on our lives, and especially our physical and mental health. As this slide shows, science is increasingly telling us this. Over the past 2 decades, research examining the impacts of discrimination on mental and physical health has constantly found associations between exposure to discrimination with mental health disorders and poorer physical health. Scientists are now suggesting that there may be identifiable cellular pathways by which racial discrimination amplifies cardiovascular and other age-related diseases. So racism is costing our system money. Other symptoms of the epidemic virus upon the operating system include these: an ongoing lack of appropriate mapping and investment in models of care that are most likely to improve our people's health and well-being, a failure to listen, and I mean really listen, to the leadership provided again and again by Indigenous peoples and communities. There can be no more glaring example than the federal government's refusal to engage with the recommendations from the Uluru Statement from the Heart. While so many of us have been so disappointed by the government's response, we can also be heartened to see moves by other jurisdictions, Victoria, the Northern Territory, and more recently Western Australia, to address issues such as treaty and a voice to Parliament. These are critical steps in the right direction, but we still require that national leadership. We hope and trust that the federal government will find ways to engage meaningfully with the Uluru Statement, maybe through the recommendations of the Joint Select Committee on Constitutional Recognition. If we're going to reset the relationship, we need to do more than press a meaningless button. We must fundamentally overhaul the operating system so that we tackle racism, embed cultural safety, and I'm going to talk about cultural safety a bit, across all levels and areas of our lives and work, build trust and healthy relationships. Underlying all of these issues, of course, is the fundamental need to redistribute power. You only have to look at photographs of the people in our parliaments and on the boards that govern health services around the country to know what I mean. And we certainly have done that at Katzanem. When we look at internationally and nationally at all the boards, we have one Aboriginal person on one of those boards that makes decisions, and that's me. And we know from Dr. Mark's Locke work that governance and decision-making processes often serve to marginalise Indigenous peoples rather than centring us in the decisions about our lives. So I'm with Maggie, I'm not going to any more reference groups. So how do we reboot our operating systems? Or should I say, give it the boot? We have to begin by acknowledging that the operating system remains a profoundly colonial apparatus. It can never be a useful or safe system for our people without seismic change. The current operating system needs more than an update, it needs some serious intervention. The system needs to reflect on itself, to problematise itself instead of us, and to privilege our voices and knowledges. We are agents of change, the makers of culture, and we hope that disruption is ahead. Rather than running an operating system that is built upon and perpetuates colonial worldviews, we need an operating system that is founded in our Indigenous worldviews, knowledges and values, including caring for country and respect and reciprocal trusting relationships. To frame it differently, how do we create opportunities for our people? Instead of blaming our people, how do we create opportunities for them to direct the system? And if we make mistakes, and mistakes are made, then remember this is how learning occurs. It is not Aboriginal failure. It is not proof that we are incapable or don't deserve benefit of the doubt or self-determination should be denied of us simply because we fail. Australia needs an operating system that privileges the voices and knowledges of Indigenous peoples of this vast land. How much might wider Australia also benefit if this was the basis of our shared operating system? Amongst other benefits, it would ensure that policy is made not for the privileged majority, as is now the case, but for those with the greatest need. This sort of operating system would ensure that birthing on country was widely available and valued, and that there was a much needed focus on the first 1,000 days. It would ensure that there was a secure long-term investment in primary health care, particularly in the Aboriginal community-controlled health sector. It would ensure that there is proper analysis of gaps in service provision and an appropriately funded response to addressing these gaps, true needs-based funding. We know our people would use health services if they were culturally safe and they were in their area. A healthy operating system would reframe debates around accountability to put onus on governments to be responsible and responsive to the communities that they should be serving, rather than choking the sector with overly onerous reporting requirements that the Lowacha Institute has told us about and counterproductive funding arrangements. Yes, we need to move beyond the magical reset button to embark on a deeper, more meaningful and more profound change. One of the important steps in this journey of change is to build a shared understanding of the history of this place we now call Australia. This is fundamental to reconciliation, and we've done some work in this area with our nursing and midwifery professions to talk about historical truth-telling, but most importantly, historical acceptance, and what this means for the education of our professionals and resetting our relationships. When we owned this shared understanding together, this means all Australians have a deep appreciation for the 75,000 plus years when our ancestors cared for this country. Our knowledge and values have so much to offer during these times of profound challenge caused by xenophobic movements, environmental degradation, and growing social and economic inequality. This is also important for our Indigenous health students and professionals. Our long history of caring for country and for each other is something that should be recognised and acknowledged. I know when I went to university, it was almost the case that birthing occurred in this country with the arrival of the First Fleet. I didn't hear that our first Indigenous nurse was in 1903. It's something all Australians should be proud of. If our schools and universities affirmed our long history as carers and healers, how much easier would the journey be for our Indigenous health students? Instead, too often the norm of our education and training systems do not validate us as Indigenous peoples. We must also develop a shared understanding of the true history of the more recent colonial project and its ongoing traumatic impacts. Historical truth-telling must become recognised as core business for efforts to improve our health and well-being. There will be no healing for us unless the wider Australian community embarks upon this shared journey of historical truth-telling. This slide shows the formation of lock hospitals. So these were institutions off mainland Australia, and they were put there for people that had communicable diseases like leprosy. Many of our people were taken to these lock hospitals and our families never saw them again. In these institutions, our peoples were subjected to medical incarceration and experimentation without explanation, let alone consent. Atrocities such as sterilisation was performed. The health system has an important role to play in providing leadership in historical truth-telling, and I was delighted to see the AMA recently stepping up to the plate in endorsing the Uluru Statement. It is Katzenam's deep belief that the truth will set us free, and we can only ever travel as a country at the speed of trust. As some of you may know, I have the pleasure of chairing the National Indigenous Health Leadership Forum, and I acknowledge my colleagues in the room. Our submission to the Joint Select Committee on Constitutional Recognition, in it we stated that truth-telling and acknowledgement of past injustices will establish a sound basis for the further progress towards health and healing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The need for truth-telling for the nation to understand and address past and ongoing trauma is crucial. Agreement-making processes that properly secure safety and opportunity for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is needed. Of course, there are many ways to remake an operating system. There are two approaches we could try here, and the first way is the Big Bang approach, and I don't mean the TV show. I've mentioned enough TV shows. The Big Bang approach where you chuck it in the bin and it makes a big bang. I'm not sure how feasible this approach is, given the complexity of our health system with so many layers and components. The second way is to create real change by rewriting the operating system, bit by bit. And I believe this is what we are starting to see. For example, Katzenam worked with the Nursing and Midwifery Board of Australia to rewrite our professional codes of conduct to mandate cultural safety. Trust me, this was not without resistance. It was in the media. And we are on the cusp of embedding cultural safety into our work, into the work of the health practitioner legislation. So internationally, cultural safety is in the legislation for health practitioners in Canada and in New Zealand, but we don't have it here. And Minister Ken White has certainly championed this work. And the nursing and midwifery professions are on the cusp of making a formal apology to our people for their past historical roles in harmful practices. Followed by the historic apology that was made by the Australian Psychological Society, which has provided such a wonderful example for other professions to follow, including perhaps bureaucrats and politicians. So I just put that one on the table. So we are beginning to see a movement building within the health professions towards embedding cultural safety, acknowledgement and historical truth-telling. This will go a long way to increasing the capacity of health services to make reconciliation real and provide respectful, culturally safe relationships and care. As I look around the country, I also see how the Aboriginal community-controlled health sector is providing innovative models of community service and leadership for the wider health system. The sector is rewriting the operating system through its exemplary leadership. A great example is Iwi and their data sovereignty, driving change in programs through population planning. And it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge the amazing work of Redfern Aboriginal Medical Service, the torchbearers of the Aboriginal community-controlled health sector, and the work of Daryl and the amazing team at Tharawal. In the Northern Territory, the Catherine West Health Board is now in its 15th year of providing health services to the region's people, built upon holistic understanding of health and wellbeing, and embedded with values such as respect and trust. This is the board's vision. And when I look across Western New South Wales, I see the Darawal Elders Group and their recent launch of an action plan for children and young people. They are working with the community, with researchers and across the sectors to build a vision for their future of their young people. And then I look closer to my own country in South Australia. I see the Aboriginal Health Impact Statement Policy Directive, which aims to ensure that programs that have an Aboriginal impact are developed in the best possible way and actively engage Aboriginal stakeholders. This mirrors the work that was done in New South Wales. Along with the appointment in South Australia of a Commissioner for Aboriginal Engagement, this is another example of efforts to rewrite and improve the operating system. As I travelled this vast nation, I can see the impact of SAMRI and the Lowitja Institute's work in challenging mainstream research narratives and practices and setting the lead for the wider research sector to follow. An example of our mob challenging and rewriting the mainstream operating system through our leadership, innovation and intellectual firepower. And it would be remiss of me not to mention National Congress and the RSA. As I look around at the hard-won gains made by our deadly committed people, I'm always reminded that our work is built upon the strength, courage, wisdom, but absolute patience of our ancestors and elders. And I was also delighted to read recently about how our cultural healers, our nunkeries, are increasingly being brought into the Western health setting to work beside health professionals and I hope in the future to lead health professionals. Our cultural knowledge and practices have so much to contribute to the system's reboot. When you have all of these developments happening at all levels of the operating system, some small and confined, others more sweeping in their application, I think we're starting to see the beginnings of real change happening in the operating system. Changes that are being led by our organisations, communities and peoples. These changes stand in stark contrast to what I remember when I was at school in the 70s and 80s, 40s. There was no Aboriginal flag and there was no welcome to country. I learnt as a young girl at school that Aboriginal people had died out and that our language was lost, as if it was being taken somewhere and been put somewhere and we couldn't find it, when in fact it had been stolen and denied us. This memory of enduring impact of education is a reminder for us to also think about the changes happening outside of the health sector that have such a profound implication on our health. As we watch the impacts of initiatives like the groundbreaking media company Indigenous X challenging and transforming mainstream narratives, we're also seeing the strengths in the diversity of our people's leadership across place, across sectors and across generations. I'm so proud of the many deadly Indigenous health professionals like these great men and women. I'm proud of our researchers and policymakers, the government ministers and the work that you do, but we need more of you. I never fail to be impressed by your commitment, your hard work, your ingenuity, your leadership and your wisdom. It's not an easy job, but we're not nearly as far along to remake the operating system as what we need to be. We could achieve so much if we were backed by an operating system that supported us. Unfortunately, there's no shortage of examples of how the system is not only failing us, but is inflicting harm and trauma. Just recently we heard about how a magistrate in Broken Hill issued an arrest warrant for a 28-year-old woman, Miss Delina King. For various reasons, Delina had been unable to make a court appearance and to give evidence in a domestic violence case. So just to be clear, she was the victim in the case. But the police arrested her and held her in prison cells overnight. Not surprisingly, she said this experience added to the trauma she'd already experienced. Just imagine how that has affected her trust in the system that was meant to protect and support her. And Dr. G and his experience in a hospital just before his death. A world-renowned musician, Dr. G, died in a hospital from internal bleeding. His manager later told ABC Radio that he believed life-saving treatment was delayed because staff assumed his liver damage was the result of alcohol abuse, rather than a chronic hepatitis B infection he had had since he was a child. Then there's Miss Ju, and the tragic case that shows that health professionals and systems are unsafe for Indigenous peoples. When this is the case, the outcomes can be fatal. If you haven't read Dr. Gregory Phillips' article in The Conversation, I'd encourage you to do so. In this case, the coroner found that Miss Ju's medical care was deficient, and both the police and the hospital staff were influenced by preconceived notions about Aboriginal people. The nexus between the legal and the health system is too often punitive, harmful and life-threatening for our people. The justice and policing systems are key sites for intervention to improving our health and well-being. At Katzenham, in our fields of practice, we hear many other stories of systems inflicting harm. In fact, just the other day, one of our members told me about a student nurse had expressed to her that she felt Aboriginal people felt pain a different way. Therefore, the Aboriginal patient didn't need as much pain relief. Some of our women are virtually forced to leave their communities towards the end of their pregnancies, and in some places between the stages of 36 to 38 weeks. Respected Brisbane-based researcher Professor Sue Kildare once told me of an expectant mother in a remote community who said she wanted to delay her departure from the community by just 1 week. The health professionals threatened her and said that if she did not get on that plane to be taken to the closest hospital, they would report her to Child Protection Services. This level of coercion being used on an expectant Aboriginal mother is shocking and reminiscent of what Australians would hope, was a bygone era. Professor Kildare also shared another story of a hospital that discharged a new mother and put her on a long bus ride home to her community. But they didn't ring anyone to tell her that she was to tell them that she was coming. So when that new mother and her new baby arrived in town at 3 a.m, there was no one there to meet her. She didn't have a mobile phone and she had no means of contacting anyone to pick her up. So what could she do at 3 a.m. in the morning? She walked for an hour with her new baby to get home. When I hear stories like that, I feel sick to my stomach. I feel sick that this system that is meant to help people can inflict such trauma. And I feel sick because I know in my heart that these are not isolated stories, but stories that each and every one of us in this room could tell about these types of experiences with either us as individuals or our family members, and where we have suffered. This is why so much of our focus and our work at Katzenham is working on a health system that is truly culturally safe, so that when me and my family walk into a hospital or a clinic, we are not automatically in fight or flight mode, but experience a sense of well-being, belonging and security. Cultural safety is the experience of the recipient of care, yet is the responsibility of the health system, as emphasised by Dr. Gregory Phillips in this quote. A myth about cultural safety is that you will learn about Aboriginal peoples. The gaze is outwards and comfortable, but this type of training is not cultural safety, but cultural awareness training. And although cultural awareness training is useful, NACHO has this to say about cultural awareness training and its role in this very critical hard work that we have to do. So, critically, in cultural safety training versus cultural awareness training, there is no cookie-cutter approach. We are not homogenous peoples. Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Australians represent a diverse nation of people, well over 300 nations in fact. Hence, non-Indigenous people can never know all there is to know about us, and there is no tick list as to how you treat Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples. In contrast, cultural safety's gaze is inwards. It's knowing about thyself. Cultural safety is about having knowledge of one's own culture, attitudes, assumptions, beliefs, and it can be challenging to sit in cultural safety training. It's being aware of your racial discourse and your racial orator and your unconscious bias. It's an awareness of our attitudes and where these attitudes come from, and how these preconceptions can be unlearned if they exist, or healthy attitudes reinforced and celebrated. Through this approach, culture safety focuses on systemic and structural issues and the social determinants of health. Swing back up again. At Katzenham, we believe that there are many opportunities where we can embed cultural safety. So if we embed it into systems and we don't leave it up to individuals, when individuals leave it remains there. We believe opportunities exist in accreditation, health service and professional standards and throughout the whole system. And we also believe that it needs to be championed by leadership. And I have to acknowledge Minister Wyatt's work here and particularly Minister Hazard's work. You might have seen some of his work where he's championed cultural safety and he got a bit of backlash in the media. But also in Canberra, we've actually trained the whole of the Indigenous Health Division in cultural safety training, and that's a 2-day training course. So cultural safety represents a key philosophical shift from providing care regardless of difference to care that takes account of people's unique needs. This is a critical shift from thinking that health professionals should treat everyone the same, or that they need to learn about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people rather than learning about themselves. These actions are a means to challenge or eradicate the racism that destroys lives and for our peoples to establish trust and respect in their healthcare encounters. When health services are culturally safe, they're more likely to be accessed by people who are also more likely to experience better health outcomes from these services. Promoting a framework of cultural safety in healthcare will also improve the recruitment and retention and wellbeing of Indigenous nursing students and midwives. However, at the moment, although we are the largest Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health workforce, Indigenous nurses and midwives represent only 1% of the nursing and midwifery workforce, and this is simply not enough. We need another 5,500 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses and midwives to reach population parity. In fact, Katzenham has calculated that if we factor in burden of disease, and we've factored it in by 2.5 times, and that's fairly conservative, we need 17,000 more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses and midwives right now. That's 6.5 times more than the current population that we have. There is an urgent need for a dedicated strategy for growing and supporting the Indigenous health workforce. This is not something that should be embedded within mainstream health policies. This should be dedicated. We need dedicated scholarships, and I'd like to acknowledge the great work of the New South Wales and Victorian Government and what they're doing around nursing and midwifery cadetships and clinical placements to grow our workforce. And we need to retain Indigenous students through to completion through initiatives like mentoring. And we need to develop and deliver high-quality curriculum content on Indigenous health, culture and history and cultural safety and pre-registration training. Embedding cultural safety into our health system will have a direct impact on improving the poor health outcomes of our people. As we advocate for embedding cultural safety across and beyond the health system, we also advocate for an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Authority, which was a recommendation out of the 2009 Health Hospital Reform Commission, to ensure appropriate investment in appropriate models of care for our people and to identify and fill service gaps. Governments have quite simply failed to provide a level of investment in health services and programs for Indigenous peoples that comes anywhere near meeting their needs. We are the leaders in challenging racism through the application of cultural safety within the health system. However, there is still much work to be done. And we know the health system can only do so much for health. So many of the factors affecting our health are determined outside of the health portfolio and outside of health services, and so I return to the Uluru Statement. It offers clear signposts on how to make a better, fairer operating system, one that provides a sound and safe basis for efforts to improve our health and wellbeing and to address historical and contemporary injustices. The Uluru Statement says, "We seek constitutional reform to empower our people and to take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution." When we make the vision provided by the Uluru Statement a reality, when we make this operating system that benefits all Australians, that is how we do the reset in a meaningful way that is real and sustainable. I invite each and every one of you here today and your professional associations to consider making a joint submission, to make a submission to the Joint Select Committee asserting implementation of the Uluru Statement's recommendations. I would like to acknowledge the nursing midwifery organisations that have agreed to support the submission, and if you'd like to support the NHLF submission, whether as individuals or as organisations, please be in touch. And you don't need to wait for governments to act on what we have asked for in the Uluru Statement. Here are 10 things that your organisation could be doing right now. Please take your cameras out and take a pic, because I'm not going to have time to read them, but they're in the slide for you to take a photo of. Oops, no, they're not. There they are. In closing, in my life, like many of us, I've witnessed so many changes in technology. In the 70s, I was listening to records and tapes, winding my tape back with a pencil because my boombox wasn't working. If I wanted to make a phone call, which I usually did on a Sunday because they were cheaper rates, I had to walk down to the local phone box. If I wanted to do research, I had to go to the library and learn something called the Dewey system and go through Fisher seals. I would never have imagined that 30 years later we could do all of these things from a device we call a mobile phone. If we can make seismic shifts in technology, surely we are capable of recreating the operational system for the Australian health system. I'm sure, like me, you don't want to leave this work, this upgrade, for our kids to do. All of this work will take bravery, it will take trust, and my favourite, perseverance. In closing, I'd like to end in the words of an inspirational man. Change will not come if we wait for some other person or if we wait for some other time. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the change we seek. Thank you.